who is late. um, thank you all so much for waiting on me. I appreciate that. But yeah, so good evening, everybody. So we are going to talk county taxes tonight, which is actually very interesting and something that is a really good gateway to understanding more about how our local government operates, what it does for us. Our taxation committee has put together a great evening for us this evening. And I don't want to take up too much more time than I already have. I apologize for my tardiness. So I will go ahead and turn it over to them, but we'll do a land acknowledgement before we do that. So before we get started, I would like to acknowledge the original caretakers of this land, the Duwamish, Suquamish, Tulalip, and Muckleshoot tribes. Without them, we would not have access to this gathering or to this dialogue. So I hope that we all can keep them in mind as we discuss things tonight. Okay, thank you so much. And without further ado, I will turn it on over.
Hey, hi, this is Laura Weiss, and it's my privilege to introduce our speaker, Dwight Dively. And I think it's pretty neat that he's willing to come again and talk to us. He now has 2 jobs with King County. I mean, I was amazed to find that in addition to his job that he's held since 2010 as director of the Office of Performance Strategy and Budget, he is also now the chief operating officer of King County.
Oh my.
And some of his responsibilities involve developing and overseeing the county's $11.4 million biennial budget, leading implementation of King County's strategic plan, using performance measures to improve county services, and overseeing 9 of the 10 operating departments. That sounds like a lot. As you know, King County is the most populous county in our state, but did you know that it's also the 12th largest county in the country? Gives you an idea of what's involved. Before coming to King County in 2010, Dwight was director of finance for the city of Seattle from 1994 to 2010, about 16 years. And for 7 years before that, he was the policy director for the Seattle City Council for 7 years. So this is really deep into local government, if you look at Dwight's experience. And if that wasn't enough, he is also affiliate associate professor at the University of Washington's Evans School of Public Policy and Governance, where he teaches classes in budgeting, public finance, and governmental structure. He has been named the school's outstanding teacher for 5 of the academic years in which he has taught there. So if you didn't realize already, and now you know, we are very fortunate to have Dwight with us tonight.
Good evening. Thank you, Laura. The only thing I would correct about your introduction is it's billion, not million. So it's a.
Oh yeah, I should have. Yes, that. Well, actually, that's pretty important for us to. How I got. Thank you.
Oh, it's okay. It's okay. I always, when I talk about the federal budget, I start struggling with trillion, and that just seems like a really big number, but that's the numbers they use. So
is it Everett Dirksen that talked about $1 million here, $1 million there, and pretty soon you start talking about big money. So
about real money, yeah.
Real money.
Thank you. Good evening. So I actually have a presentation that's a fairly eclectic presentation. Some of you have heard me before. I think this is at least the 4th time in the last 10 or 12 years that I've had the chance to present to this group I always look forward to it. And so tonight, what I thought I would do is use some of the same material that we've talked about before, but I also want to talk about some of the real big policy trends affecting the finances of local governments in Washington state. I want to share with you some information about what's happened with COVID and how that's affected our budgets. I want to share with you some ideas that I have about how the future is really going to be very different than the past, but that the truth is that none of us really know. So I have a set of slides that I'm going to put up here, and if you give me just a moment, let me grab them. All right. Uh, so as Laura mentioned, I have the privilege of teaching about 3 classes a year at the University of Washington. And so we've kind of finally gotten this Zoom technology down. So I've learned that I actually need 2 different computers in order to do this effectively. So I'm going to go back and forth a little bit between the one I'm using video and the one I'm using the slides. So let's see here. I need to use this keyboard. So as I was thinking about tonight's presentation, I thought it would be helpful for you to kind of categorize local governments and their revenue sources. And as I thought about this, I think I can put them pretty much into 5 different categories. So you have county governments, which are typically dependent mostly on property taxes. There's sales tax, a relatively small portion of the sales tax that goes to county governments. County governments collect various kinds of fees. And then depending on the services that they do, they get certain federal and state monies for things like road services, things like human services, public health. And again, different counties do different mixes of those things. So every county, when you look at it, is a little different on the federal and state funds. Cities have the broadest array of revenue sources that are allowed under state law. So they have property taxes and sales taxes, but they also can tax utilities, and some do at frankly very high rates, 20% or more in some cases. Ooh. Tax businesses in multiple different ways. They also impose fees, and then depending again on the city government and what it does, they can get federal and state funds. A third category of local government are transit agencies. And in most parts of the state, these are freestanding governments. They're not part of any other government. In King County, they're actually part of King County government. So Metro Transit is a county department, unlike Pierce Transit or some of the other transit agencies, community transit in Snohomish County, that are their own separate governments. And transit agencies rely on sales taxes, the fares they collect from their riders, and the federal government provides a significant amount of money to transit agencies. A fourth category are the school districts, which mostly depend on state money, but they also have the ability, less than they used to, but still some ability to ask their voters for their own property taxes. And then there's also federal money that goes into school districts. And then finally, there's a huge array of other special districts. So port districts, fire districts, library districts, hospital districts, cemetery districts, mosquito control districts, and the list just is endless, frankly, in this state. And they depend on either property taxes almost entirely, like fire districts and library districts, or user fees like our water districts and our sewer districts. So they are a whole separate category. And in Washington state, we are in love with special districts. From the beginning of our state back in 1889, there was a great distrust of larger governments with multiple functions, and instead a preference for a plethora of governments with single functions. So if you look around the state, we actually have about 5,000 different governments, which frankly strikes me as insane. The state of Hawaii has a total of 8. We have over 5,000. And so it is really a different situation here where we really want all kinds of very small single purpose governments. So as you are thinking about local governments, I would encourage you to think in these kind of 5 categories with their own specific revenue sources. So the next thing I thought would be of interest to you tonight is to just kind of summarize, and I have several slides about this, some of the important issues about the revenues for local governments in Washington state. So the first one I put on here, I think all of you have followed, revenue in Washington state for the last couple of decades, are familiar with this. So starting in 2001, the state has limited the revenue growth of government property taxes to 1% per year. So that's the state itself, its cities, its counties, its fire districts, library districts. There was originally an initiative that put this into place. The initiative was thrown out by the state Supreme Court. The legislature and governor put it back into effect. And so each government can only raise its property tax revenue 1% per year. There are 2 exceptions to that. You get to add the value of new construction. So when there is significant new construction, as we've experienced here, you end up with a lot of additional revenue. And then you also can go to your voters to approve a higher percentage increase in your revenue growth. And so King County government and the city of Seattle particularly, but also some of the other cities, Bellevue, Mercer Island, have gone to their voters with these things called levy lid lifts to raise that 1% limit, and have generally been very successful in getting voter approval for that. So that's one particular issue that continues to this day to be an issue. A second issue is we are creating in many parts of the state more and more special districts, each of whom relies on property taxes as its particular revenue source. So the most recent example in King County is the people on Vashon Island. They're nonprofit or for-profit healthcare providers, doctors' offices basically, said we aren't able to financially succeed here. And so in order to keep a local doctor's office, they formed a hospital district to impose another property tax that would in essence subsidize a nonprofit healthcare provider so that they had a doctor's office on Vashon Island. And so this is a continuing issue where we have more and more of these governments. And because of the statutory limits on property taxes, as you layer more and more governments on top of each other, you eventually start to come to limits that are set out either in the state constitution or state law. And you get to a point where something happens that's called pro-rationing, where the levies of certain governments start to be reduced or eliminated because the overall property tax rate is too high. So that's another challenge we're facing here. And I saw a quick question in the chat about what's the percentage vote approval for a levy lid lift? It's 50%. So unlike a lot of other ballot measures for property taxes that require 60% approval, the levy lid lift only takes 50%. All right, a third thing I want to share with you, and I'll come to this in a couple of slides. We have more information about this, is the declining productivity of the sales tax. And what's happening is as our economy changes, as our preferences change, the sales tax generates less revenue than you would expect because it applies to a smaller and smaller share of our purchases. And I'll come back to that in a bit. A fourth thing I put on this list was the fact that our sales tax rates now are getting extraordinarily high. We are almost the highest in the United States. Believe it or not, there are a couple of places in Alabama that have higher sales tax rates than we do, but we're getting real close. And as I think many of you know, our state and local tax system is the most regressive in the United States. In other words, lower income people pay a higher percentage of their income in taxes than higher income people do by a huge margin. And every time we raise the sales tax, we make that system even more regressive. And so our continued dependence on the sales tax means that we are increasingly making it harder for our low income people without really disadvantaging those of us that are privileged to have a higher income. Another factor that I don't think I've ever shared with this group before is, and you could debate whether this is a good thing, bad thing, or just kind of an okay thing. King County increasingly subsidizes the entire rest of the state. And I'll share some data with you about that. I would personally say that as a rich county, we should do that. Whether you believe that the amount we're doing that is legitimate, I think is a more open question. And also, I have to say, I feel like most of the rest of the state never acknowledges the reality of that. They think, in fact, the opposite is true. And then the final thing that I don't have any slide for here, but through a series of court decisions, the courts have decided that existing state law gives cities the ability to tax things that almost without limitation. The state Supreme Court fairly recently, on a technicality, decided that the city of Seattle can't have an income tax, but just about any other tax appears to be legal. And I'll just say that when I was the finance director in Seattle up to 11 years ago, we didn't believe we had any of these authorities to impose taxes. But the courts have interpreted existing law basically around business taxes to say that cities can tax just about anything. Very few of them have taken advantage of that, but the city of Seattle definitely has. And so that's a whole new dynamic in this, that the city of Seattle is pursuing taxes that, essentially no other city is doing, and that aren't available to state or to the city, to county governments or any other government. So that's just an interesting dimension to be aware of. All right, so this is this graph, which those of you that have been to this presentation before, you've seen a version of this earlier. This one obviously is updated, is to show you the effect of the 1% revenue growth limit on property taxes. And so this is King County's general fund, the fund that supports the traditional activities of a county government. When you take out all the things we do on behalf of others, the property tax is roughly 60% of our general fund budget. That's very typical of counties around the state, that it's about 60% of their budget. And the right-hand bars, they're kind of in a gray color here, are how much we actually collected. And the left-hand bars, which are in blue, are how much we would have collected had the property tax just kept up with inflation and population growth. And, in the early years, the difference is small. as time goes by, one of the most powerful things in the universe is compound interest. So as the difference between the two growth rates changes, every successive year it gets bigger. So by last year, 2020, our actual property tax was a little less than $400 million. And had we just kept up with inflation and population growth, it would have been about $250 million more. And so one of the reasons that, in fact, the biggest reason that county governments in Washington state are increasingly unable to deliver services is the 1% property tax limitation on the single largest revenue source that has now been in effect for 20 years. And that's why I'll be super frank, we have not been able to have a public health function that is as robust as it should have been. And so when COVID hit, we have the best public health function in the state, one of the best in the country. But had we not been in this situation, we probably would have had another 2, 3, 400 people in public health, and our ability to respond to COVID would have been that much greater. But when this kind of revenue exists for 20 years, this is the kind of consequence that you see. All right, so let's move on to the sales tax that I mentioned a little earlier. So this is a largely unrecognized trend, and it's one I have shared with this audience previously. If you go back about 25 years into the mid-1990s, of every dollar of personal income received by residents of King County, they spent about half of it on things that were subject to the sales tax. So cars, clothing, furniture, restaurant meals, construction, remodeling, car repairs, electronics, all of those kind of things. And you can see that over a long period of time, it has gradually declined. And the kind of gray bars there in the middle are the Great Recession. And you can see it absolutely plunged in the recession when people cut back on their spending. And even in the last couple of years, the last couple of good years, so 2017, 18, and 19, it's now around 36%. So what's the consequence of this is sales tax revenue growth in this state has not kept up with personal income growth. And there are a lot of reasons for this. And I don't know that anyone has ever been able to kind of ferret out how much each of them attributes to it. One of them is the increasing inequality of income, because people who have very high incomes spend relatively little on things subject to the sales tax. They're investing, they're traveling, they're doing things that aren't subject to sales taxes. And so as our incomes become more disparate, that tendency gets worse. A second factor that goes into this is that we haven't changed the sales tax base in any meaningful way since 1935. So our sales tax is based on a Depression era economy that was almost all about purchases of goods. Today we purchase a lot of services, and most services are not subject to the sales tax. And so because we still have a Depression era tax base, but our economy has changed the mix of things that each of us purchases, that has decreased the productivity of the sales tax. And then another major factor is, and this is particularly true in King County, is a changing preference of what people consume, particularly younger people. So a lot of the younger people who are coming out of college have very large amounts of debt. So they are spending their income on paying off their student loans. None of that, of course, is subject to sales tax. They're renters as opposed to homeowners. So they're not buying furniture, they're not buying, garden supplies, lawn equipment, things like that, that those of us that own homes would buy. They are, in many cases, not purchasing cars. They use public transit or, Uber or Lyft or some of these other technologies. And so their expenditure patterns are very different than when you or I were in our 20s. And the things they tend to purchase are much less subject to sales taxes than things that we tended to purchase at that same age. So that's a whole nother dynamic in this about a change in what people actually want to purchase. And so, as a state that is heavily dependent on sales taxes, the fact that our tax base is less productive than it used to be means that revenue growth is slower, significantly slower than our income growth on average in the state. And I think many of you know that if you look at Washington state government's budget, about half of its general fund is sales tax, more than any other state in the United States. So this kind of a long-term trend has a very significant debilitating effect on the state government's revenues. All right, so let's move on to the next item. I thought it would be worthwhile to just itemize for you what the sales tax rate today in the city of Seattle is and which government gets which component of it. And, if you go to Bellevue, if you go to North Bend, if you go to Everett, there are slight differences from city to city, county to county. But, we're typically, at least in the Puget Sound area, in the high 9s to the low 10s. So I'll run through this fairly quickly. It's just pretty obvious what's here. The state still gets the largest portion, 6.5% of the total. That tax rate has not changed since 1983. So the state has not raised its sales tax rate for nearly 40 years. Local government, the cities and the counties split 1%. And so within a city, the city gets 85/100ths% and the county gets 15/100ths%. Obviously, outside of cities, the county is the only government to get it. So the county gets 1%. It is a surprise to most people that transit gets significantly more than general purpose governments do. So here in King County, Metro Transit gets 0.9% and Sound Transit gets 1.4%. So Sound Transit is the second largest recipient of sales tax revenue in its service area, second only to the state. And this, of course, is by far their largest single revenue source. There are then three other quite mysterious, people are not very aware of them, 0.1% sales taxes each, of which two of them were imposed by King County government. The voters did not vote on them, and one was voter approved. So the first one I put on the list is one of the ones that the King County Council imposed now about 15 years ago, is 0.1 cent that goes for behavioral health programs. So drug treatment, therapeutic courts where people who have drug or mental health issues are basically separated from the traditional court system, handled differently, and then for mental health treatment programs. The official name under state law is mental illness and drug dependency, or MID is the acronym. That's sort of archaic language. We don't use those words anymore, but that still is what is written into state law. How much does a 1/10 of a cent raise each year? County-wide in a non-COVID year, about $70 million. So it feels like a low tax rate, but it's a lot of money in a typical year. So the next one is a criminal justice sales tax that is split between the county and cities by a formula that the state made up back in the 1980s. And they literally made it up. They had no policy basis for how they did it. They just kind of guessed at it. And for those of you that lived here in the early and mid 80s, you will remember the gang problem. And there were lots of people who were very concerned about the gangs and the weapons they had, and police departments were outgunned, and the courts didn't have enough capacity. So the state legislature created this criminal justice sales tax that was voter approved, and it's in place in most counties, not every county. King County has had it now for about 25 years. And then the next one is one that is brand new. It just literally started in January, is a 1/10 of a cent sales tax authorized by the state that is for basically housing programs and treatment programs for homeless people and other people who are low income and in need of housing. And so the King County Council approved this back in September. It was implemented in January, so we'll start to get money from it next month. And if we get some changes to the law that we're seeking in the current legislature, our plan is to use this in the first couple of years, mostly to acquire existing buildings that can be converted into what we call permanent supportive housing. And so we're looking at hotels, motels, nursing homes, places like that, where you would be able to take folks who are homeless, bring them in, give them housing, and then also add services, whether it's drug treatment services, mental health services, employment services, so that they eventually can move out of that facility into a more permanent housing arrangement. And also, recover from whatever illnesses that they have. Okay. And then the final one, this was also approved by the voters in November, is a Seattle transportation levy, most of which goes for transit service in Seattle. This is technically imposed by the Seattle Transportation Benefit District. And I will just get on my high horse here for just a second. The legislature, when it created these authorities, did not give them to city and county governments. They gave them to new governments called transportation benefit districts, which interestingly are governed by the same elected officials as the city or the county. So the Seattle Transportation Benefit District is a separate government whose 9 board members are the 9 city council members. Now, thankfully, they don't actually get any additional compensation for that, which is nice, but it is a whole separate government that has all of its own accounting, all of its own legal issues, all of its own financial reports. So there is $1 to $2 million a year of incremental costs to run this separate government that are, in my opinion, simply waste because they add no actual value. But that's what our legislature does, is rather than just saying, okay, we want to give a new authority to a city or to a county, we create yet another new government that has all of these overhead functions. So that was the last one that's added. And so today, if you were in Seattle and you walked out after this meeting, bought something subject to the sales tax, you would pay 10.25%. All right, let's move along. Let me check on how I'm doing for time. We're doing pretty well. So here's the point I mentioned earlier about King County essentially is supporting the rest of the state. So if you look at the 39 counties of Washington state, this was a study that the Office of Financial Management did a little over a year ago. Sadly, the data is actually from 2016, which is the last year they had data, so it's a little out of date. There were only 2 counties that pay way more in taxes than they receive in state services, King County and San Juan County. Not surprising because they're the counties that have the highest property values in the state. So in King County, the taxpayers got back in services 63 cents of every dollar of taxes they paid. So less than 2/3 of the taxes came back in state services for King County residents. San Juan County, frankly, is even worse. They were 58 cents. There are 6 counties that come very close to being even. So they basically get very close to $1 for every dollar that they pay. And I listed them there. And then all the remaining counties are net beneficiaries. So 31 counties receive significantly more in services than their residents pay in taxes. Not surprisingly, the very rural Eastern Washington counties are by far the biggest net beneficiaries. And they sadly have almost no economic activity. They're very, they're relatively fewer jobs. They pay very poorly. The property values are low. So it is not surprising that the, kind of minimal services they get are way more than the revenue they pay. I put this in here just to note that, and this gets, from year to year to year, this gets even worse. And so at some point, I think our residents in King County, as we approach them to vote on more things locally, will start to feel like they're paying too much because so much of what they pay doesn't actually deliver services here in King County. So it's just another trend to be aware of. All right, so the last part of the presentation, I thought I would share with you a few things about what COVID has done to local governments in Washington state. So one thing to note is that the pandemic and the recession had very different impacts to different kinds of governments. So governments that depend on property taxes, so fire districts, library districts, counties to a considerable extent, school districts, haven't suffered meaningful revenue losses. The property tax collection rate is still very, very high. We did in many counties allow people to delay their payments for a while, but the vast majority, 97, 98, 99% of the property tax payments were actually made. So if you're a government that relies mostly on property taxes, COVID has had minimal impacts on your revenues. In contrast to that, if you are a city or another government like a transit agency that is heavily dependent on sales taxes, you got hit really hard. So we have some cities that have had very valuable sales tax bases, typically where you have car dealerships and shopping centers. So Fife, Tukwila, Linwood, places like that got hit really hard because stores were closed, people didn't go shopping, they switched to online purchasing. And so those cities that depended on sales taxes and similarly transit agencies took very large losses. And so they're the places where you see big budget cuts, layoffs, salary cuts, and so on, is those governments that are dependent on sales taxes. And then I added here, just as a note, the federal government obviously has done a lot with COVID response. They did a lot very early. Then there was a very long pause while we basically had the election. They did some in November. There's obviously conversation in Congress now about doing more. To date, the federal money has had to be for new things. So in essence, new responses you're making to COVID. No money has been provided to offset revenue losses. The bill that is being considered in Congress right now, I actually spent an hour yesterday looking for that bill. I couldn't find it, which tells me that they haven't made it public yet. And so I'm sure they are still haggling about the money they've set aside for state and local governments. Is that only for new things that are COVID response, or will they allow those governments, at least in part, to use it to cover their revenue losses? So this one is a kind of to be determined. So another thing I thought I would share with you is the unevenness of the impact of COVID on our economy. So what's on this slide is the sales tax base throughout King County. So in other words, this isn't the revenue of any particular government, but this is the taxable sales throughout all of King County. So within every city, within the unincorporated area, this is the grand total. And the last data we have is from sales that occurred in October. There's about a 2-month lag in sales tax. So from the time it's collected by a merchant to the time it goes through the state and gets to a local government. So we'll get November, tomorrow probably, and just a day late for this presentation. So what this is a comparison from October 2019, which is obviously pre-COVID, to October 2020, which is kind of when we started back into the kind of dark phase of COVID. We had a little more light in the summer and things were doing a little better. And then in October, it was back worse again. And so it's phenomenal how disparate the impact has been. In a typical recession, what we see is all sectors of the economy are affected. Everybody is negative. There's some that are more negative than others, but everybody is negative. In this situation, which is unprecedented since we've had sales taxes in this country, there have been huge winners and there have been huge losers. And I just excerpted some here that I thought would be of interest. So one huge winner has been building materials. I don't know about in the areas where you all live, but I live in Magnolia. And as I walk around here every morning, there are more remodeling contractors, more home builders, more people building fences than I have ever seen in the 25 years I have lived here. Part of it is that people who are working from home still have as much income as they ever did. They can't take vacations. They can't go to restaurants. So they have a lot of disposable income and they're fixing up their house. Or, hey, I'm working from home. We don't have enough rooms. My spouse works from home. My kids are in school from home. So they're remodeling the house so everybody has their own room. It's an incredible phenomenon that the building materials industry and that segment of the construction industry that uses them is up by about 25%. So that's a huge winner that I have to say, I don't think I ever expected. I could not have told you back when COVID started, oh yeah, that's going to be a sector that's going to come out ahead. The next one I would have guessed would come out ahead, huge increases in electronics. So everybody is buying computers so they can work from home, cell phones, fancy TVs because you can't go to the movie theater. So we're going to stream stuff at home. And so the electronics sector is way, way up. The big box retailers, so the Costco's, the Best Buys, they are doing phenomenally well. They were able to stay open when a lot of the smaller retailers had to close down. They sell things that people want to buy in large quantities. So we actually had James Senegal from Costco come to one of our county cabinet meetings back in the summer, and he talked about the incredible increase in sales they had of certain products and how they had to work with their supply chains to go from 8-hour days to 24-hour days. They advanced hundreds of millions of dollars to their suppliers to ramp up production of toilet paper and all the other things that people wanted to buy in huge quantities. And so that segment of the retail economy is doing really well. Another one that surprised me is motor vehicles, car sales. And this is particularly used cars. And I hadn't figured that out. One of our county council members who is friends with a car dealer happened to tell me one day, hey, the car dealer told me that their new car sales are kind of flat, but there's this huge demand for used cars. And that's because a lot of people that historically took public transit either aren't taking it because it's been cut back so much or are afraid to take it because they don't want to get sick. And so they've gone out and purchased used cars for their work commute. So car dealers have done really well. Construction, it's surprising to me, is just about flat. I would have expected construction to really have trended down, but construction continues to do, pretty much the same as it did a year before. All right, and then the ones at the bottom are the obvious losers. Probably none of these are a big surprise. So all the clothing stores are way down, particularly with people, not going into the office. I have to say, I wear a tie once every 2 weeks when I go to the county council meeting and present. I haven't worn a suit in 10 months. So the kind of purchases of clothing have gone way down. People aren't going out, they're not traveling. And so that has taken a big hit. Restaurants, despite their creativity and doing takeout and all kinds of other things, restaurants are down 41% from a year before. And then by far the hardest hit has come to the hotel motel sector. And actually, Seattle is the hardest hit city in the United States for the hotel industry. We are here very dependent on like cruise tourism. We are dependent on people coming here from Japan and Far East for tourism. A lot of summer tourists coming here, a lot of conventioneers coming here. And so the Seattle hotels are actually down about 90%. And the rest of the county is a little better off. SeaTac is only down about 50%. So on average across the county, we're down 81%. So that, of all of our economic sectors, that's the one that has gotten hit the hardest. All right. I thought I would touch briefly on the local COVID response spending. So cities, counties, and transit agencies have gotten a significant amount of federal money and to a lesser extent state money for COVID response. And that's great. I mean, I think we all very much appreciate it. No government had the infrastructure in place to do this. Suddenly, in King County's case, $262 million appeared from the feds in April, and we had no infrastructure to do grants, and all the kind of things that we are trying to do to get money out to help people. So folks who had absolutely no experience doing grant programs or federal contracting suddenly got told, in many cases by me, you have 1 week to figure out how to do this because we have to get this money out. And so it has been a huge challenge. Every government that got money has set its own priorities. So is it purchasing personal protective equipment? Is it supporting vaccination? Is it testing? Is it isolation? One of the things King County did is we leased a whole bunch of hotels, and we took all the folks who were in homeless shelters and put them into hotel rooms. We've done food support programs. We've done rental assistance programs. You were allowed to cover your staff costs that were affected by COVID. So every government did this in its own way. And at some point, 2 years later, I hope somebody goes around and gathers up some information about what everybody did, because it would be fascinating to see the differences between King County and Pierce County and Snohomish County and Spokane County. What did everybody do with the money they got? And then I guess finally I will note, the federal government basically imposed the same rules that it always imposes on federal grants. They didn't say, hey, we're in a pandemic, we've never been in this case, get the money out. We know that some of it might get misused, but we're going to live with that. They didn't say that. They just said you have to follow every single rule we have to do. And so we are, in many cases, giving out $25,000 grants to nonprofit organizations who will probably spend $5,000 on filling out all the paperwork that they have to do to comply with federal rules. And then the other thing is that literally from week to week, the federal government would change the rules. They would say, you can't spend any money on this. And then a month later, oh yeah, that's okay. And then a month later, oh, well, it's okay, but only if it goes in this way. And so you were constantly responding to changes in rules. And just to give you an example, King County, like many other governments, finally hired a consulting firm that is very familiar with federal contracting. And so we're going to end up probably spending $3 million on a consulting firm to help us make sure that we complied with all the ever-changing rules. And I just have to say, again, being super frank, is that really a good use of public money to pay a lot of high-paid consultants to make sure you follow ever-changing and complicated federal rules? I don't think so, but that was the reality that everybody was in. All right, and so to end here tonight with a presentation, now I'll be happy to take questions. I think one of the fascinating things to talk about is, what does the future look like? So I believe that the economy has been permanently changed by COVID. There will never be a time we go back to February of 2020. Our economy will never look like that again. I have some speculation that I've put here about what will change. It's only my opinion. I frankly don't have a whole lot of idea what will happen. I think this is going to be fascinating to observe. But I did note, kind of 4 questions or thoughts here that are I think I'd share with you. So first of all, people shifted even more than they had before to remote purchases. I can't tell you, I'm sure you can observe it for yourself, how many delivery vehicles drive down my street every day from UPS, FedEx, Amazon, black vans that aren't marked, white vans that aren't marked, cars that drive by at 3 a.m. and drop stuff off. It's a huge change. And I think that it'll shift back a little bit, but I think a lot of people have gotten used to the convenience of, you just go online, you order it, and it shows up. So the idea that we're going to go back to more traditional retail in the way we did, I just don't think is going to happen. And I would simply note that it was fortuitous that the state of South Dakota, back in 2016, started litigation around whether they could tax with their sales tax online sales, which previously through a previous or US Supreme Court decision, they largely could not. And in 2018, in this case of South Dakota versus Wayfair, by a 5-4 vote, the US Supreme Court said, yes, states can impose their sales taxes and require them to be collected by online sellers. Were it not for that decision, state and local governments with sales taxes would be far worse off than we are today, because a huge proportion of those online sales would have escaped sales tax. So that was very fortuitous time. A second thing I put here is that for many employees, telework has proven to be pretty popular, and businesses have realized, and organizations like governments have realized, that telework actually is pretty good for them. So yes, some people will come back to the traditional office environment. Some people will come back, 1, 2, 3 days a week. Some people will probably work from home almost all the time. And so the kind of the future of the traditional office building, I think, is a fascinating question to discuss. In the near term, a lot of employers are bringing back part of their workforce and spreading them out. So they'll need all of that office space. But once we're through COVID, will we revert to cramming everybody together in small cubicles, and you'll need half the space you used to have? I don't know the answer to that, but I think it's going to be different. I can just tell you, for King County government, we have operated now for 15 years with 3 major downtown office buildings, not counting the courthouse. And we're in the process of mothballing the old one, the administration building, moving everybody into the other 2. And we'll be able to do that with no difficulty and save a whole lot of money by not running an old, worn out building. And I think we're going to see a lot of employers do that. You may have seen in the newspaper, Nordstrom announced that they're downsizing their downtown Seattle office space as well. Okay. Another point I think that is completely unclear is how quickly tourism and convention businesses are going to come back. Most of the folks in that industry think it will come back. The sense is it's 3 or 4 years in the future. I saw just a couple hours ago that Canada is closing down cruise tourism all of this year. That seems like a premature decision to me, but that's, they get to make that decision. So, that will have a big impact, will prolong this. And so that's going to be a big factor. And then the last thing I put on here is something that I think is invisible to just about everybody. In Washington state, the basis for property tax assessment is lagged by a year. So the assessment of property that's in place for this year, 2021, is based on the value of that property on January 1, 2020. Okay, and so January 1, 2020, buildings like hotels in King County were extremely valuable. So their tax burden this year is high. In 2022, their tax basis will be January 1, 2021, when they're basically vacant. So the value of all those buildings will go way down. And because of the way our property tax works in this state, the burden will shift more to residents. So there's going to be a big change in property tax burden from commercial property to residential property next year. Now, it'll gradually shift back, but that's just something that has not gotten any attention, and I thought I would bring to your attention because it's the kind of thing I know that this group is interested in. Okay, so we are a little past 8 o'clock. So I am going to discontinue the slides. Let me shut them down here. And I am happy to answer questions that folks have.
Okay, well, thank you, Dwight. A lot to absorb and think about. So I know there are questions on the chat, and I have some people that were checking Adele, do you have something that you found that would be a good question? Oh, maybe Adele has to unmute herself.
Yeah, thank you. Uh, Megan addresses a question, and I'm interested in it because it has to do with our homelessness situation. She says, I'm now priced out of the duplex home that I've rented since 2012 due to property tax hikes that have been passed on to me as a renter. I was hoping this meeting would help me understand what can be done to prevent this from continuing.
So this is a very common problem in a high tax area like King County, where our values have gone up so much. And so the principal idea that has been advanced is to do what's called a homestead exemption. And it's complicated to do it for rental property, but you can do it if you work on it enough. And the idea here is to exempt a certain amount of the value of a residential property from property tax. And a lot of states do this. So they might, in King County, a kind of realistic example would be to say, okay, of the value of a residential property, the first $100,000 would be not subject to tax. So if the property was worth 200,000, you basically reduce the tax by half. That's a common model in another state. It requires a constitutional amendment to do that in Washington state. But that would be the most effective way to change the property tax to deal with the situation you described. Of course, the alternative is to have more public housing that's available for lower income people that is not subject to property tax at all.
Okay, well, thank you. What about, let's see, Mary Lee Fuller was also going to be looking. Megan says, thank you, thank you. Mary Lee, are you unmuted?
Well, I think this is a question that we're all interested in, and that is from Kathy. Are any proposals for new tax revenue being considered? And maybe you could comment on some of the ones you're familiar with, Dwight.
Yeah, so at the state level, many of you are probably familiar with, there is this wealth tax proposal that would apply to anybody who had more than $1 billion of wealth, which I am told is 14 people in Washington state. And it's unclear to me, frankly, whether it's constitutional. But there's a lot of interest in it, and it would not shock me to see that pass. The governor has proposed, in addition to carbon taxes, the governor has proposed a capital gains tax, which is a form of an income tax on a particular category of income. So that's certainly in play. As I think most of you would know, the city of Seattle has imposed this high earners tax, which is now subject to litigation. And I don't have a good prediction about whether that will survive litigation. And so those are really the ideas of significant tax structure changes. There is a state committee that was formed a couple of years ago that has looked at tax reform and is going to be doing hearings around the state this year on a series of ideas that have been suggested. So for those of you that are interested in this, I would track that work. And, if you want to, obviously you can go to a forum on that and provide your input about their ideas. I have one of the staff people in my office who's actually following that. And the goal of that work is that get public comment next year, and then to actually develop ideas that would be available for the 2023 legislative session. And I think it's kind of premature to know what those are. Obviously, an income tax in some form is going to be on that list. I personally think we should be seriously looking at extending the sales tax to some of the services that are provided. that would make it much less regressive. It will also make a significant increase in revenue. So there's a lot of ideas out there, but other than this, billionaire tax and capital gains tax, those are the only two that are really seriously in play in this session of the legislature.
There's an additional question that's on that same topic. Are there efforts to get rid of the 1% lid? That's from Lucy.
Well, I am certainly interested in getting rid of that. We came really close 4 years ago. And I would say that were it not for COVID, there would be a reasonable chance for that to happen in this legislative session. But because, they're doing it all virtually, they're trying to keep the number of bills pretty limited. I would be very surprised if they did anything with it in this session.
Okay, let's see. How about Joanna Cullen? Are you unmuted, Joanna? I guess she's not
Sure.
here.
Yeah, I'm here.
Okay, good. Did you find some questions or?
Well, I had a lot of questions, I guess. I remember putting quite a few, but on the subject of the 1% lid or that 10, okay. So how fair would that really lead to more fair taxes, since property tax for, like, my home is a bigger percentage of my asset than it is for a really rich, uber rich person. So I don't see how that would really lead to more fair taxes.
So, Joanna, one of the things that, in addition to this homestead exemption, 2 years ago, the legislature significantly expanded the senior and people with disability tax exemption, which isn't a full exemption unless you're very low income, but at least it's a partial exemption.
You must be seeing my gray hair. And while I am concerned for seniors and people that have been in housing for that same house for a while, I'm also concerned about, my daughter who buys a home, the young people who want to move in here, and the lack of sort of the diversity of income who can afford to buy in my neighborhood.
Yeah. So to that point, Washington State is heavily dependent on sales tax, far more than any other state. And our property tax burden is pretty typical for a state. We are very heavily dependent on excise taxes on particular products. So, we have the highest liquor tax in the United States as an example. And then, of course, we have no income tax. And overall, Washington State combined state and local government is an above average tax burden state, but only a little bit. And if you look at it compared to our wealth, we are actually a below average tax burden state. And so for many people who look at this, and of course not everybody agrees with this, the reason that the situation that you're describing exists is we don't tax income in any way. And so the folks who are very, very high income, this is the absolute best place in the United States for them to live because we don't tax that income. If we had an income tax and we didn't raise the overall tax burden, you would have significantly lower sales taxes and property taxes.
Can I comment? I have checked before the average tax that a Washingtonian pay, and it was not that high compared to other state, but that's average, and it's very misleading. If you do regionally, the people who live in King County in Seattle has pretty high overall tax per capita, even compared to any other state. So I really don't like to use the average number.
Yeah, that is a good observation. And when you do it per capita, it ignores the fact that our average income is very high. We're one of the highest average income areas in the country. The government of Washington, D.C. does a study every year, and they take the biggest city in every state, and they do a sort of relatively rich person and a median income person and a relatively low income person. And they add up their tax burden. And Seattle obviously is the biggest city in Washington state. And so in Seattle, of the 51 cities, because they include Washington, D.C., to be as a relatively high income person, Seattle is third lowest in burden on the higher income person. And we are the third highest in burden on the relatively low income person. So it is a great place to be if you're a relatively high income. It's terrible if you're a lower income person. And it's a little worse than average if you're a middle income person. And again, that's because of the structure of our taxes.
Okay.
Right.
I just would like to ask you about the issue of proliferation of special districts. How many special districts, or how many, I should say it how many governmental entities are there in King County right now?
Let's see if I remember. Some of you know Fred Jarrett, and he would have known that number right off the top of his head. If I remember correctly, it's about 120.
And is there any movement to stop the proliferation of special districts, or is that going to continue at least as long as the 1% limit is in place?
So there is one tendency to combine, which is the fire districts are starting to amalgamate into a smaller number because there's some obvious efficiencies in having a larger service area and more efficiency being able to go from station to station and so on. So that in Western Washington, the number of fire districts is actually decreasing. But I would say the countervailing force to that is the legislature's continuous desire to add more districts. So every time somebody wants to do something new, the solution is add a different kind of district. And so we're staying about even because those two forces are counteracting each other.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I noticed that when you talked about Seattle's percentage of that was King County's percentage of the sales tax. Seattle also has the Metropolitan Park District, which is collecting more taxes. Well, let me go back to Adele and see if she's found any more questions from the chat.
I have one more.
Oh, all right, Joanna.
I was wondering, you said that the court found on a technicality that Seattle could not have an income tax, but did their decision show a way forward that perhaps we could get an income tax?
So that, Joanna, that is a great question. So a little history here. So in 1934, Washington State had an income tax. And there was litigation about whether that was constitutional under our state constitution. And in a 4-3 decision, the Washington State Supreme Court said it was unconstitutional because it was a graduated income tax. The higher your income, the higher the tax rate you paid. So just like the federal income tax. And the court looked at US Supreme Court precedents, and they decided that income was a form of property. And in the Washington State Constitution, as in many other state constitutions, it says that property has to be taxed uniformly, which means that each government that has a property tax has to impose the same rate everywhere in its jurisdiction. So because they said income is property, they said the state could not impose an income tax that had different rates depending on the level of income that was non-uniform. So the state then gave up on the income tax and implemented the sales tax, the B&O tax, and other things instead. So since that time, many of you know there have been probably, I think, 5 different efforts to create an income tax, all of which have failed at the ballot. There is, I think the majority of tax attorneys in this state who've looked at the question would say that if the state legislature created an income tax, even a graduated income tax, and the decision got back to the state Supreme Court, they would uphold the income tax. And the reason is that the US Supreme Court precedents that were relied on in 1934 have all been overturned. And so the speculation is the state Supreme Court would say income is not property, it's something else. And therefore, that constitutional limitation on property tax does not apply to an income tax. So, and I personally find that persuasive. I don't think that's a 100% guarantee, but I think it's likely. So if the legislature ever was willing to take the hard vote to create an income tax, I think most people who are expert in the field think it would be upheld by the state Supreme Court. And so the effort to tax capital gains is probably, I mean, I don't know what is in everybody's mind who is proposing it, is probably a way on a limited basis to test this. So it's not an accident that Governor Inslee proposed this, but said it won't go into effect until 2023. And that's because he knows there will be litigation. And he's basically figuring out how long it'll take to get to the state Supreme Court and for them to make a decision. And if they were to uphold the capital gains tax, then that's probably almost a certainty that a regular income tax would also survive review. So I think a lot of us believe that the capital gains tax, there's a whole policy basis for it, but it's really a way to test to see what the state Supreme Court will say about an income tax.
How would it work if the state passed something that said they were going to tax everyone's income for all the income you make over $300,000, for instance, or over $1 million or something like?
So that's the kind of tax that the existing state Supreme Court decision would say is unconstitutional. But that is probably what they're really trying to, at least some legislators are really trying to do. And I don't know where the line would be drawn, but they are trying to create in essence, a high earners income tax. And I think the capital gains tax is a way to kind of test that to see if it would survive judicial review. And if it did, then what you just said, Joanna, would clearly also survive.
Oh, this is a slightly different topic, but I know that a public bank is being discussed in the legislature. How do you think that would affect local governments?
So I have I'm just saying I'm speaking on my own. I'm not representing King County here. So just make sure everybody knows that. So the public bank is a very intriguing idea. I have to note there is only one of them in the United States. The state of North Dakota has a public bank. They've had it for 100 years. And it was created for a whole bunch of interesting historical reasons. They love it. It works really well for them. They are a very different state than Washington State. For me, the critical factor in understanding a public bank is, what do you want it to do? And if it's a limited set of functions that are around investing government money, so you're not relying on Wall Street to do that, potentially providing financing for relatively low interest rates for governments that might not be able to access it themselves, that all is pretty simple and pretty doable. But many of the people who want to do a public bank wanted to start to get into things like student loans and support for small businesses. And that gets much, much more complicated. And you need actual real bankers to do that. not, I'll just use the word bureaucrats. You need, standards about that. You, in my opinion, you can't politicize that stuff, or you're going to end up losing a bunch of money. The state constitution forbids lending of credit. So to do some of those things, you need to amend the constitution. So I think is a fascinating idea. I understand the motivation for it. But I personally would argue before we should be talking about creating one, the legislature should pass a study bill and say, we want to examine this idea and all the different permutations of it, all the different versions that you could create, and appoint a committee that has people that actually understand public finance and private banking and really work through all those options before you would consider legislation on it. So my personal opinion is that it's premature because we haven't thought out all those things.
So actually, the bill is already available, and it's in the businesses and financial services and trades committee, and then they're going to have an executive meeting on February 9th to decide whether they're going to pass through that bill, the public bank bill. And the bill was very narrowed down compared to the one that has been proposed for last 10 years. And it's very focused on financing infrastructure, investment and money to the local government. That's the emphasis. And there is no retail banking services, no individual, according to the state constitution, they will not deal with any individual. They only deal with members. Members has to be a public entities, and they can deposit money into the public bank, and then they can access the pooled money for their infrastructure project. And then the bill said it will gives a lower interest rate and low fees, and it gives financial advising. I didn't say it's cost or not, but those are the kind of functions that they want to give.
So this is a very interesting conversation, and I think we're getting ready we should start to wind up here and give a great big thanks to our speaker for, again, helping us at the League understand complex topics, taxes, and so on. I want to say that we're hoping to be presenting. I'm Nora Leach, and I am the chair of the Economics and Taxation Committee. And we put on this program. Laura Weiss is the one who made it happen. She's incredible. But I also want to say that we are thinking of the future of having another presentation on state taxes and also one on federal taxes, both all intertwining. So we hope that you all in the audience, I think they're like 57, we had a very good audience, almost 60 people today. So thank you all very much for coming. And Laura, do you want to say?
Well, yeah, I just thank you, Nora. I was going to introduce you, but you introduced yourself. That was good. And just a big thank you to Dwight. Appreciate this is such a complicated, big subject, but you've given us a way of understanding it by looking at the issues that you outlined tonight, and I really appreciate it. So we can we raise our hands and clap virtually here. That really appreciate it, and I hope we'll be meeting again soon to talk more about taxes. But thank you very much.
You're welcome. Good to be here.
All the slides that were there, I think we're going to be able to make them available to people. Is that true?
Yes, you should have. I sent them to you, so feel free to use them however you would like.
Okay, so we'll probably post them for everyone in the audience. We'll be posting them on our
It was posted on Facebook and it's been recorded, so you can see it on Facebook.
There
Yes,
we go.
Forgot to say thank you to all of you who came. We wouldn't have had a program without you. So Oh,
and Tashley.
much appreciated. Yeah.
Thank